Welcome back. The City Island Oyster Reef is a nonprofit organization dedicated to enhancing oyster reef restoration in New York City. By re-establishing oyster populations around City Island, their ultimate objective is to boost water quality, fortify shorelines against storm surges and flooding, and revive the diverse ecosystem historically linked to the region. Joining us now is the Secretary of the Board of Directors at City Island Oyster Reef, Barbara Burn Dolensek. Barbara, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, just to start off, can you tell me a little bit more about the City Island Oyster Reef and elaborate a little bit on its mission?
Well, we were founded about 4 years ago when it became clear that City Island had a very old oyster history. Apparently, most of the oyster industry, which was enormous in the 19th century, actually started on City Island with the construction of reefs to enhance the natural reefs. And so I am also an officer at the City Island Nautical Museum, and we put our heads together and thought that actually restoring reefs would be a wonderful way of bringing back oysters into the areas, the waters around City Island. Unfortunately, you can't eat oysters out of these waters because they are still polluted. But we know that oysters can clean 50 gallons of water a day, and that they also can build up reefs that will prevent storm surges, which is a concern, during this whole fear of climate change and rising tides on City Island, which is a big issue for most of us.
Absolutely. And as you just mentioned a little bit about climate change, so can you tell me about how the condition of oyster reefs impacts the quality of water?
Well, again, because the individual oysters do clean an enormous amount of water a day, along with ribbed mussels, which are also exist on the shoreline. The problem, of course, now is that City Island, like many other areas on Long Island Sound, is surrounded with seawalls and buildings and other pieces of construction that that mean that the oyster restoration is not that easy. However, we've tested the water quality all around City Island. We have applied for funding that we have received, which will enable us to test further. We have oyster cages full of oysters. Baby oysters are usually fertilized by their parents in the water, and then they go and join up with other oyster shells or with oysters, and that's how a reef is formed. And we thought that if we could study how that happens and make oysters available, we collect shells from restaurants here, and we cure them in the open air for about a year. Then they are covered with spat, which are baby oysters, and then we've been putting them in boxes all around City Island. These have been donated by the Building Oyster Project, which is doing much of the same activity in New York Harbor. We consider ourselves a separate organization, although we rely on them a lot for their expertise. But one of our main issues really is enlightening the community around us. I'm old enough now that I'm not going to see a lot of climate change improvement in my lifetime. However, the youngsters at PS 175, for example, and at other schools around the Bronx, the more they learn about what oysters can do and about how important oyster reefs are, biodiversity, which means bringing in other kinds of creatures that live naturally in this area but have been moved away because of pollution. So this educational component is really a very important part of what we do. So we like to get the public involved. We get them involved by doing fundraisers, by having our water jubilee, which is coming up on August 5th, which gets a lot of kayakers and young people involved. We're very busy all the time, it seems to me. We're all volunteers. We don't get paid for what we do. We do hire interns, young kids. We've had lots of help from the Boy Scouts. We've created a learning center behind PS 175 on the water, belongs to the Parks Department, but we've been able to clear out the Japanese knotweed, all the garbage that accumulates on a daily basis. And we really have a very dedicated group of board members and advisors who we again apply for funding, but we've got some very important funders, and we are recognized by the Long Island Sound Futures Fund as a very important movement in Western Long Island Sound, which has been neglected over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a little bit, I do want to get to your shell collection movement as well as your educational initiatives at PS 175. But for now, when I was reading a little bit earlier, I saw that, the organization mentions that it's not necessarily about improving drinking water, but more so marine environment around City Island. So can you elaborate a little bit on this and the significance on this?
Well, of course, it's not about drinking water since, we don't drink the salt water. But what we would like to do is to increase the cleanliness of the water for swimming, for boating, for, again, as I say, biodiversity. We have problems with the Hutchinson River, which is quite polluted and pours right into Eastchester Bay. We know that the health department of New York City will test the water periodically and find it every now and then after a big thunderstorm where there's been a lot of rain that suddenly sewage pours into the waters around here. We're just hoping that if we can establish oyster reefs in anything like the quantity that they were during the 19th century, the water quality would just be that much improved. It would be a miracle in a way, but we can't stop trying. And I think that once everybody begins to understand, that's the importance of the education of involving the community, is as soon as people begin to understand that that what we're doing is really about improving our chances to survive climate change, then I think that we get a lot of support that way. It's non-political. It's completely located, it's City Island. It has to do with the community, but it also has very strong support from scientists and people who are on our board, who are scientists, who are able to interpret the information that we get from monitoring the water quality. Every weekend during the summertime, we are out there on our skiff, improving or testing the water, testing the number of oysters that have either died or have increased their size. We measure each new baby as it grows. All of this is very carefully documented, and so we use that, and not only in our fundraising, but also in speaking to teachers and in speaking to members of the community who care a lot. A lot of people here on City Island love to swim, they love to kayak, they love to paddleboard, they love to sail, and they care about the quality of the water, which is a very important. If you live on the water, you have to care.
Yeah, I mean, of course, absolutely. And so, with that, you mentioned a little bit about teachers. And so I want to speak about your educational component, which you kind of already mentioned a lot about. So can you tell me, when somebody signs up for one of your educational webinars, what can they expect?
Well, the educational webinars have been on various and sundry different subjects. So some of them are quite specific and quite scientific, and some of them are quite general. I just finished one on the history of oystering on City Island. Most people are completely unaware of how important City Island was in the whole development of the oyster industry. A man from Connecticut named Orrin Fordham moved here in 1830 and invented a system of planting oysters, of planting reefs, and that is part of City Island's history. The Billion Oyster Project is a fabulous organization in New York Harbor, and they have done an enormous amount of work to try. Their idea of the billion oysters is to have a billion oysters in New York Harbor by 2035. And we have learned a lot from them, not only educationally, but in terms of using these oyster cases that in which we store oysters in the water. And they've helped us with their educational program too. They've taught our interns and our board members a great deal about how to proceed. But we are an independent group, and but we live on an island. City Island is kind of special in that way. We are part of the Bronx, and we're proud to be part of the Bronx, but we're also our own place.
Absolutely. I feel like in just this short amount of time, I've learned so much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. But on that note, Barbara, I want to thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Great. Well, it was fun, and thank you so much for your good questions.
Thank you. So, for more information, you can visit the website at cioysterreef.org and follow them on Facebook at City Island Oyster Reef.